What happens when the world's most powerful man demands 60% of your nation's gold and oil? But instead of bowing down, you say no? That's exactly what Burkina Faso's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, just did. And in rejecting former U.S. President Donald Trump's demand, Traoré didn't just protect his country's resources. He sent a shockwave across Africa and the entire globe. Stay with me, because this is the story of Africa's boldest rejection yet, the demand that shocked a nation. The story begins when reports surfaced that Donald Trump, back on the world stage, demanded a staggering 60% share of Burkina Faso's gold and oil, not loans, not aid, a direct cut. For many, this was an ultimatum: surrender your wealth or face consequences. Who is Ibrahim Traoré? But Burkina Faso is no ordinary nation today. It's led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier-turned-leader who has become the symbol of African resistance. At just 36 years old, he is Africa's youngest president and already being called the new Thomas Sankara. Why gold and oil matter so much? Burkina Faso is one of Africa's top gold producers, with billions underground. And while the country is still developing its oil potential, early reports suggest untapped reserves that could reshape the economy. For the West, this is opportunity. For Traoré, this is survival. Trump's bold move, Trump's reported demand, was framed as partnership. But to many in Africa, it looked like modern colonialism. 60% is not partnership, it's dominance. And Traoré knew accepting it would mean enslaving his nation's future. Why Trump wanted 60% expanded. To understand Traoré's defiance, we need to step back. Why would a U.S. president demand 60% of a nation's gold and oil? It sounds outrageous, but this is not new. For decades, African nations have been treated like resource banks for the West. Gold, uranium, oil, cocoa, even rare earth minerals, used in your phone right now, extracted and shipped out, leaving African nations with scraps. France, Britain, the U.S. all played this game. So when Trump reportedly pressed Burkina Faso for a massive 60% share, he was simply echoing an old colonial script. The difference? This time, the script did not go as planned. Echoes of Sankara Traoré's speech carried echoes of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987 after resisting French exploitation. Sankara once said, "He who feeds you controls you." Now, Traoré was living that same principle. The people rise in support across Burkina Faso's streets. People waved flags, chanted his name, and praised his courage. Entire avenues turned into rivers of humanity, painted in the colors of the nation. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders, telling them, "Look closely. This is what real freedom looks like." For years, African leaders bowed to Western pressure, signing deals that drained their lands of gold, oil, and dignity. But here, they saw something new. A leader unafraid to stand tall, a man who chose sovereignty over submission. The air was electric. Marketplaces turned into rally points, drums echoed in villages, and even elders who had lived through colonialism said they had never witnessed such unity. The rejection of foreign demands was no longer just a political act. It had become a movement of the people. And as Traoré's name echoed through the chants, one thing became clear. This was no longer just about gold or oil. It was about pride, identity, and the birth of a new chapter for Africa. Western backlash begins, but the West wasn't going to stay silent. Within hours of Traoré's bold rejection, media outlets in Europe and the United States framed the move as reckless, dangerous, and a threat to global stability. Critics warned of sanctions, investment cuts, and diplomatic isolation. Western diplomats spoke in carefully chosen words, but the underlying message was sharp. Do as we say, or face consequences. The message was clear. Defy us, and you will pay the price. This was the same playbook Africa had seen before. punishments dressed as policies, pressure disguised as partnership. Think tanks rolled out reports warning of economic collapse. International investors suddenly paused deals, and rumors of aid cuts spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was a warning shot to any other African leader who might dare to follow Traoré's example. Yet, for the people of Burkina Faso, these threats didn't spark fear. Instead, they fueled a deeper sense of resolve. If standing tall came with a cost, many believed it was a price worth paying for dignity and independence. The African awakening. Yet, instead of fear, other African nations began to take notice. What happened in Ouagadougou was more than a political decision. It was a spark. From Mali to Niger, leaders praised Traoré's bold stance, openly voicing support in speeches and state media. In Ghana, Senegal, and even South Africa, commentators began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can say no, why can't we? For the first time in decades, Africa saw unity in defiance. Borders and languages didn't matter. What mattered was the shared experience of being pressured, exploited, and undervalued by global powers. Ordinary citizens across the continent felt the ripple effect too. Social media platforms exploded, with hashtags celebrating Traoré's courage. Videos of young Africans chanting his name in crowded markets and university campuses went viral. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about rewriting Africa's future. A continent long described as dependent was suddenly finding its voice. And for many, Traoré wasn't just a soldier in uniform. He had become a symbol of African pride and the possibility of true independence. Trump's reputation on the line for Trump, this wasn't just about resources. It was about prestige, dominance, and the image of America's reach. Gold and oil were valuable, yes, but what mattered more was the message. The United States demands, and the world obeys. If a small nation like Burkina Faso could say no, what would stop bigger nations from following? That question shook Washington. Diplomats worried that Traoré's defiance might inspire a chain reaction across Africa, Latin America, and even Asia, where resentment of Western control has always simmered beneath the surface. For Trump personally, the stakes were even higher. His political brand was built on strength, negotiation, and winning deals. To be openly rejected by a leader of one of the world's poorest countries risked painting him as weak on the global stage. Media networks seized on the drama. Headlines blared, "Burkina Faso challenges Trump's America," and "the beginning of a new African resistance." Every rejection became a story. Every silence from Washington looked like hesitation. Trump's reputation wasn't just under fire abroad, even at home. Critics began mocking the idea that the world's most powerful man couldn't get his way with a country of 20 million people. And in politics, perception often matters more than reality. This wasn't just a diplomatic dispute. It was a battle for pride, image, and global influence. The geopolitical earthquake. This single rejection shifted alliances overnight. Russia offered support. China expressed interest in fair trade. Suddenly, Burkina Faso wasn't alone. The shadow of the IMF and World Bank. For decades, African nations lived under the shadow of the IMF and World Bank. These institutions claimed to offer help, but the reality was far harsher. Loans came with strings attached. Privatize your industries, cut subsidies for your people, open your markets to foreign corporations. It was less a helping hand and more a leash that kept entire nations dependent. Generations of African leaders accepted these terms, believing there was no alternative. Roads, hospitals, and schools were often built not to serve local populations, but to satisfy foreign investors. A cycle of debt was created, one that seemed impossible to escape. But Traoré's bold decision shook this belief to its core. By rejecting the usual path, he showed that an African country could chart its own destiny, one not dictated by Washington or Brussels, but by its own people. His message was simple yet powerful. Why beg for loans that come with chains when Africa holds the resources the world desperately needs? Gold, oil, rare minerals. They were already in African soil. Why should Africans borrow money for development when they could finance it themselves with their own wealth? To many across the continent, this wasn't just defiance, it was liberation. A glimpse of a future where Africa no longer bowed to financial overlords, but instead stood tall on its own foundation. And for the IMF and World Bank, Traoré's move was more dangerous than any protest, because it threatened the very system that had kept Africa tied down for generations. Africa's long history of resource theft. To understand the anger, you must understand history. For over a century, Africa's gold, diamonds, and oil were looted by outsiders. France, Britain, America all took their share. Now Traoré was breaking that cycle. The West's fear of a domino effect. What scared Western powers most wasn't just Burkina Faso's bold defiance. It was the terrifying possibility of a chain reaction. One nation breaking free was dangerous enough, but what if others followed? What if Mali, Niger, Ghana, or even larger economies like Nigeria and South Africa decided they too could say no? The Western playbook thrived on isolation. As long as one nation stood alone, sanctions and pressure could crush it into submission. But a united Africa? That was the nightmare. Because if 20 nations rejected the old order, suddenly sanctions would lose their bite. Markets would shift, alliances would change, and the very foundation of Western dominance in Africa would begin to crumble. Imagine African nations pooling their resources, trading directly with each other, or striking deals with emerging powers in the East without permission from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. For the first time, Africa's trillions in minerals, oil, and fertile land could serve Africans first. That thought alone kept Western policymakers awake at night. This was the fear of the domino effect. Not just a single spark, but a fire spreading across an entire continent. Traoré's stand wasn't seen as an isolated event. It was seen as the first crack in a dam that had held for centuries. And if that dam broke, the world order would never look the same again. Voices of the youth, Africa's youth, long silenced, long dismissed, finally felt they had found a leader who spoke their language. To them, Ibrahim Traoré was not just another politician in a suit. He was young, bold, and unapologetically African. While the old guard often bowed under foreign pressure, Traoré stood tall, and in that defiance, millions of young Africans saw a reflection of their own dreams. Social media erupted. Social media. TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook lit up with hashtags calling him the Lion of Africa. Videos of Traoré speaking went viral, racking up millions of views in hours. Memes celebrated his military jacket and beret, comparing him to revolutionaries of the past. For once, the youth weren't looking back at history books for inspiration. They were watching it unfold live, on their screens, in their time. In the streets, it was the young who marched the loudest, waving flags, chanting songs, and painting murals of Traoré on walls. They didn't just see him as Burkina Faso's leader, they saw him as their leader, the voice of a new Africa refusing to be shackled by old deals and hidden contracts. For decades, young Africans were told that politics wasn't for them, that change would take time, or that the system couldn't be challenged. But Traoré shattered that illusion. He proved that a 34-year-old could stand against presidents in their 60s and 70s, against billion-dollar corporations, and even against the West itself. To the youth, this wasn't just politics. This was the spark of real independence, a reminder that Africa's future would be written not by foreign hands, not by aging elites, but by the rising generation who refused to wait any longer. The gold factor Burkina Faso may look small on a map, but beneath its soil lies a treasure chest that rivals global giants. With over 100 tons of gold produced each year, it is one of Africa's richest deposits. Yet for decades, those riches flowed out of the country, filling foreign banks while local villages remained in poverty. Gold for the people of Burkina Faso became a cruel irony. Their land was rich, but their lives were poor. Traoré decided that era was over. He knew whoever controlled the gold controlled the nation's destiny. By forcing profits to stay home, he was cutting off a lifeline that fed foreign corporations and Western governments for decades. To the outside world, this wasn't just gold, it was leverage. With gold, Burkina Faso could fund its own projects, strengthen its army, and even resist the economic stranglehold of the IMF and World Bank. For Western capitals, this was dangerous. A poor country with gold is just a mine. But a poor country that keeps its gold? That's a threat. And for Traoré, this was more than economics. It was symbolism. Every bar of gold that stayed in Burkina Faso was proof that Africa didn't need to beg anymore. That independence wasn't just a flag. It was ownership of the soil beneath their feet. Oil, the untapped power. Yet even gold pales in comparison to what lies beneath the sand and rock. Oil. Long rumored, recently confirmed, Burkina Faso's oil reserves could transform the country into an unexpected energy hub in the heart of West Africa. Imagine a landlocked nation, once dismissed as powerless, suddenly holding the key to fueling, not only itself, but its neighbors. That vision, a new energy giant rising where none was expected, is what keeps global powers awake at night. Oil doesn't just create wealth, it creates influence. Whoever controls the pipelines controls politics. Whoever sells the barrels shapes alliances. For Western powers, Burkina Faso's oil was supposed to be theirs, signed away in contracts before locals even knew what was underground. But Traoré's refusal flipped the script. Instead of opening the gates to foreign giants, he hinted that this oil would power Burkina Faso first. And that is why the demands became aggressive. Oil is the bloodstream of the modern world, and no empire tolerates losing control of it. If gold gave Traoré strength, oil gave him danger. Because now, he wasn't just defying contracts, he was threatening the very fuel that drives global dominance. Trump's silence. After the rejection, when Traoré dismissed Trump's demand, the world expected an immediate storm, threats, sanctions, or at least a fiery response. Instead, what followed was unusual. Silence. No speeches, no tweets, no public outrage, just silence. But silence in politics often speaks louder than words. Was Trump recalculating his strategy, waiting for the right moment to strike back? Or was he stunned, unable to believe that a young leader from a small African nation had rejected him so openly on the global stage? For America, rejection wasn't new. But rejection in front of the world, from a country they thought powerless, that was a humiliation. The silence wasn't weakness. It was the pause of a superpower deciding whether to ignore Traoré or to make him an example. The role of France. While the headlines focused on Trump in Paris, the shock was even greater. For decades, France treated Burkina Faso and much of West Africa as its private backyard. Through the CFA franc currency, military bases, and mining contracts, France controlled gold, cotton, and even the politics of the region. But Traoré's rejection wasn't just aimed at the United States. It was also a dagger through the heart of French dominance. Suddenly, one of France's former colonies wasn't asking permission anymore. It was dictating terms. In Paris, alarm bells rang. If Burkina Faso broke free, what would stop Mali, Niger, or Senegal from following? The empire that France had quietly maintained for generations was crumbling, not with tanks, but with words of defiance. And to France, Traoré's boldness wasn't just dangerous, It was contagious. Traoré's rising symbolism. With a single decision, Ibrahim Traoré stopped being just the interim leader of Burkina Faso. He became something bigger, a symbol of resistance in a world tired of exploitation. His face, once unknown outside the region, now appeared on posters, social media feeds, and in chants across Africa. To some, he was reckless, a soldier playing politics with giants. But to millions, he was proof that even the smallest nation could stand up to the largest powers. He was a reminder that dignity was worth more than gold, and sovereignty worth more than oil. Every word he spoke began to carry weight beyond Burkina Faso. Young Africans saw him as a mirror of their frustrations, while older generations saw in him the courage they had long hoped to witness. Traoré was no longer just a leader. He was a spark that could ignite movements far beyond his borders, and that was exactly what the West feared most. The risks ahead, of course, standing up to global powers is not without danger. History across Africa is filled with examples of leaders who challenged the system and paid dearly. From Patrice Lumumba in Congo to Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso itself, the pattern is clear. When a leader resists Western dominance, they are often met with coups, crippling sanctions, and even assassinations. Traoré is well aware of these dangers. Each step he takes places him on a tightrope where one wrong move could cost not just his career, but his life. The stakes are not abstract, they are brutally real. And yet it is precisely this risk that makes his defiance so remarkable. Third, military factor as a soldier, Traoré understands risk better than most. Unlike career politicians, he has lived the reality of conflict and knows what it takes to defend sovereignty. That's why he isn't relying on words alone. He's reinforcing his position with alliances. By strengthening ties with Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations that share his vision of independence from foreign domination, he is building a regional shield. Together, these nations form a bloc that can resist external pressure in a way no single country could. Traoré's strategy is not reckless. It's calculated, rooted in military discipline and the understanding that survival requires unity. Global media reaction. When the story broke, reactions around the world could not have been more divided. Western mainstream media outlets rushed to paint Traoré as reckless, unstable, or a populist threat. Their framing suggested he was endangering Burkina Faso's future by turning away from trusted partners. But on the African continent, the narrative was entirely different. Local newspapers hailed him as a liberator, and African social media erupted with admiration. Hashtags celebrated him as a modern-day Sankara, a leader brave enough to stare down global superpowers. The contrast revealed more than just media bias. It showed a world split between those who fear losing control and those who see hope in finally breaking free. Lessons from Libya. The shadow of Libya still hangs heavy over Africa. Muammar Gaddafi's vision of a financially independent Africa made him a target, and when he pushed too far, Western powers made sure he was eliminated. Traoré knows this history well, and he is determined not to become another cautionary tale. A new Pan-African spirit, but unlike Gaddafi, Traoré is not standing alone. His rejection of Trump in the West has sparked something bigger, a Pan-African revival. The idea that Africa can be united, resourceful, and independent has returned with force. For the first time in decades, leaders and citizens alike are daring to dream of a continent free from control, the power of saying no. Sometimes history doesn't change with wars or treaties. It changes with a single word. Traoré's no has echoed across borders. It was more than a refusal. It was a declaration. A message that Africa no longer has to bow its head. What this means for the world, if Burkina Faso succeeds, the consequences ripple far beyond Africa. Global corporations lose easy access to resources. Western dominance begins to fracture, and suddenly the balance of power tilts toward the global south. Africa is not poor. It is the richest continent on Earth. The only question is who gets to control that wealth. The future of Burkina Faso, with over 100 tons of gold each year and oil reserves waiting to be tapped, Burkina Faso has everything it needs to rebuild. Hospitals, schools, highways. For once, the wealth of the land could serve the people who live on it. If managed right, Burkina Faso could transform from one of Africa's poorest nations into one of its strongest, Africa. Watching closely from the streets of Lagos to the cafes of Johannesburg, from Cairo to Dakar, Africa is watching. Ashakti. People see Traoré as proof that leadership doesn't have to mean submission, but they also know the risks. Will this bold stand mark the beginning of a new Africa, or will powerful forces crush it before it grows? No matter what happens in the days ahead, one truth is undeniable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of Trump's demand will go down as one of the boldest acts in modern African history. It was never just about gold. It was never just about oil. It was about dignity, about saying that Africa will no longer bow to pressure. This is more than a political decision. It is a turning point, a spark, a reminder that one act of courage can echo across a continent. And if you believe these stories matter, if you want to see Africa's real voice heard, not filtered, not distorted, then make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because history is unfolding before our eyes.